The rain fell on London in a relentless, grey sheet, a perfect pathetic fallacy for the transaction about to take place in the sombre, oak-panelled office of solicitors Pynchon and Pynchon. Miss Eleanor Ashford sat perfectly straight on a hard, leather-upholstered chair, her hands folded in the lap of her sensible, dove-grey dress. She was not a woman given to frivolous displays of emotion, but even her disciplined mind could not entirely quell the frantic flutter in her chest. Across the small, polished table, Captain Lord Alastair Blackwood was a study in stillness. His posture was ramrod straight, a ghost of military discipline, but it was the stillness of a ruin, not a monument. His face, handsome in a stark, carved way, was pale beneath the weathering of foreign suns. A terrible scar, pink and new, ran from his temple down to his jaw, pulling the corner of his left eye into a permanent, slight squint. His own hands, one gloved in black leather, rested on his knees. He did not look at her, but rather at a point somewhere beyond the rain-streaked window, as if watching for an enemy that never came. "The terms are quite clear," Mr. Pynchon the younger said, his voice a dry rustle of parchment. "The late Viscount, your uncle, Lord Henry Blackwood, was most specific. To inherit the entirety of the Blackwood estate, including the primary seat of Thornfield Hall, you, Captain Blackwood, must be wed to a woman of unimpeachable character and intellectual fortitude." He named Miss Ashford specifically as a suitable candidate, owing to his great respect for her late father, the renowned natural philosopher. Alastair's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My uncle always had a peculiar sense of humor." Eleanor lifted her chin. The Viscount was a man of science and reason. He appreciated those qualities in others. She kept her voice level, though the condescension in the captain's tone pricked at her pride. She was 25, firmly on the shelf, and the world saw a blue-stocking, a spinster more comfortable with a microscope than a ballroom. But she was not without her own reasons for being here. Her father's death had left her with nothing but his library and a mountain of debts. This was not a romantic fantasy, it was a strategic alliance. "Indeed," Mr. Pynchon agreed, adjusting his spectacles. "The clause further stipulates that the marriage must be consummated and produce an heir within 5 years, or the estate reverts to a distant cousin." A muscle twitched in Alastair's cheek. "That will not be happening." "The clause is clear, Captain," the solicitor pressed. "Then the distant cousin can have his mouldering estate," Alastair said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am here to fulfill the letter of the law regarding the marriage, nothing more. I will not be performing. On that, you have my word, Miss Ashford." He finally turned his gaze to her, and Eleanor felt a shock at the emptiness in his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, and just as cold. Eleanor met his gaze squarely. "Your word is sufficient, Captain. I, too, have no desire for the conventional trappings of marriage. I require security, a roof over my head, and access to a well-stocked library. You require a wife to claim your inheritance. It is a simple, logical arrangement." A flicker of something, amusement, contempt, crossed his features. "Logical. Yes. Very well." He turned back to the solicitor. "Draw up the papers. We will be married by special license. Today." The ceremony in the adjacent chapel was as bleak and efficient as the negotiation that preceded it. Eleanor wore her same grey dress. Alastair wore his regimentals, the dark blue coat seeming to hang on his broad but gaunt frame. He did not look at her as he slid a plain gold band onto her finger, his gloved hand brushing against her skin with a cold, impersonal touch. His voice as he repeated his vows was a low, hollow monotone. When the curate pronounced them man and wife, Alastair did not kiss her. He merely gave a short, sharp nod. "The carriage is waiting, Lady Blackwood," he said, the title sounding like an insult on his lips. As they stepped out into the punishing rain, a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the square, a cart backfiring. Alistair froze. For a second, his stoic composure shattered. He dropped into a low crouch, his body coiling, his unloved hand, revealing a network of angry, twisted scars, flying to his hip where a sword would have been. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with a terror that was both ancient and immediate. Eleanor stood still, her scientific mind observing, cataloging, increased respiration, tachycardia, pallor, a dissociative response to an auditory stimulus. Battle trauma. Shell shock. Her father had written about it, theorizing it was a wound of the mind, not a weakness of character. The moment passed as quickly as it came. Alistair straightened, his face a mask of furious shame. He refused to look at her, striding towards the carriage and wrenching the door open himself. "Get in," he bid out. Eleanor climbed in, settling herself on the plush velvet seat opposite him. As the carriage lurched into motion, she finally spoke, her voice soft but clear against the drumming rain. "It was a cart, Captain. Only a cart." He turned his face to the window, a perfect profile of stone. "I know what it was," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper she could barely hear. "The body, however, has a memory of its own." Thornfield Hall was not a home, it was a fortress of grief. It rose from the misty Yorkshire moors, a great, grey edifice of crumbling stone and ivy-choked turrets. Inside, it was a museum of dust and shadows. The staff, a skeleton crew of elderly retainers, moved through the cavernous rooms with a hushed reverence, as if afraid to wake the ghosts. Alistair had established their separate lives with military precision. He took the master's chambers in the east wing. Eleanor was given a spacious suite in the west wing, which boasted a private sitting room with a large, south-facing window, perfect for reading. Their paths were not meant to cross. They took meals separately. He spent his days in his study, or more often, out on the wild moors, walking for hours with only his demons for company. She spent hers in the library, a magnificent, neglected room that became her sanctuary. For the first fortnight, they were two satellites in a decaying orbit, acknowledging each other's existence only with the barest of nods if they chanced to meet in a corridor. Eleanor, however, was not a woman to be idle. She began to catalogue the library, a task of Herculean proportions that brought her immense joy. She also began to observe her husband. She saw the shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She heard the occasional, choked cry that echoed through the silent halls. She saw the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way his left hand, the scarred one, would sometimes tremble uncontrollably. One evening, driven by a curiosity that was both scientific and, she reluctantly admitted, human, she ventured to his study. The door was ajar. She found him standing before the cold fireplace, a glass of brandy in his good hand, staring at a portrait of his uncle. He was swaying slightly, his face a canvas of such profound anguish that it stole her breath. "Captain," she said softly. He spun around, his eyes wild for a moment before focusing on her. "What do you want?" The words were slurred, the stoicism drowned in alcohol. I wish to discuss the household accounts," she lied smoothly. "The accounts?" He barked a short, bitter laugh. "Delegate them to Mrs. Humphreys. You are the lady of the house, are you not? In name, at least." He drained his glass. "Leave me." But as she turned to go, his leg, the one he favored, seemed to buckle beneath him. He stumbled, grabbing the mantelpiece for support, his face contorting in pain. Eleanor rushed forward without thinking, her hand going to his arm to steady him. He recoiled from her touch as if burned. "Do not touch me," he snarled, his breath a cloud of brandy and despair. She stepped back, her own heart pounding. But her gaze was drawn to his leg. "You are in pain." "It is nothing. An old souvenir from a Pashtun Jazail. He slumped into a high-backed chair, closing his eyes. Just leave. But Eleanor did not leave. She stood her ground, her mind working, connecting the dots. The physical pain, the psychological trauma, the insomnia. Her father's theories, his experiments with galvanic stimulation and controlled respiration to treat nervous disorders. The pain is a trigger, she said, more to herself than to him. The physical discomfort lowers your threshold for the episodes. His eyes snapped open. What would you know of it? I know that the mind and body are not separate entities, Captain. They are a single, integrated system. You treat the wound to the body, but you ignore the wound to the mind, and so both fester. A look of raw, undiluted fury crossed his face. You think this is a philosophical puzzle to be solved? A fascinating experiment for a bored bluestocking? These are not equations in a book. These are men's screams in the dark. The smell of blood and gunpowder. The face of a boy you sent to his death. His voice broke. Get out. This time, she obeyed. But that night, lying in her large, cold bed, Eleanor did not think of his anger. She thought of his pain. And she began to formulate a hypothesis. The next morning, Eleanor descended into the nether regions of Thornfield, seeking out the kitchen. Mrs. Humphreys, the housekeeper, a woman with a face like a kindly apple and a spine of steel, was initially suspicious of the new mistress's intrusion. I require certain supplies, Mrs. Humphreys, Eleanor said, adopting her most authoritative yet pleasant tone. Lavender, chamomile, and valerian from the stillroom, if we have it. And I shall need access to the hot water cistern at specific times. For bathing, my lady? Mrs. Humphreys asked, perplexed. For hydrotherapy, Eleanor corrected gently. And I shall need to speak with the captain's valet. The valet, a man named Jennings who had served with Alastair in India, was a taciturn fellow, but he had a loyal, worried look in his eyes. He confirmed Eleanor's suspicions about the captain's sleeplessness and the constant pain in his leg. He won't see a doctor, my lady, Jennings confided in a low voice. Says they're all quacks. And the dreams, some nights, it's a terrible thing to hear. Armed with this intelligence, Eleanor began her campaign. It was a campaign of quiet, relentless logic. She did not ask for permission. She simply acted. She had a large, copper-hip bath brought to a small, disused room adjacent to the kitchens, where the pipes from the boiler could be easily accessed. She prepared sachets of the calming herbs. She drafted a regimen, alternating hot and cold compresses for the leg, followed by a warm bath infused with lavender to ease muscle tension and promote sleep. The first time she presented this plan to Alastair, he laughed in her face. It was a harsh, ugly sound. You presume too much, madam, he said, his voice like ice. I presume you wish to stop the pain, she countered, standing in the doorway of his study, refusing to be dismissed. This is not magic, Captain. It is science. Heat increases blood flow, promoting healing. Cold reduces inflammation. The herbs have known sedative properties. You can either continue to suffer in stubborn silence, or you can submit to a simple, logical process. The choice is yours. She left the sachet of herbs on his desk. For 3 days, it sat there, untouched. But on the 4th day, she found it was gone. And Jennings reported, with a note of awe in his voice, that the captain had slept for 4 uninterrupted hours after applying a warm compress to his leg. It was a small victory, but it was a crack in his armor. Weeks turned into a month. A fragile, wordless routine developed. Eleanor would leave her prepared remedies in his study. He would, grudgingly, use them. They began to take their evening meal together, not out of affection, but out of a weary truce. The conversations were stilted at first, circling safe topics like estate management or a book she was reading. But one evening, emboldened by a particularly clear-headed look in his eyes, she ventured into deeper waters. "My father believed that traumatic memories become trapped in the nervous system," she said, carefully cutting a piece of roast chicken. "He theorized that by recreating the physical sensations of the event in a safe, controlled environment, one could discharge the associated anxiety." Alastair put down his fork. "Recreate it? You mean, make me relive it?" "In a way. But not with the chaos and terror. With control. You would be the one in command of the memory, not its victim." He was silent for a long time, staring into the candle flame. "The worst of it," he said, so quietly she had to lean forward to hear, "is the heat. The damned, oppressive heat of the Khyber Pass. And the dust. You could taste it, feel it grinding in your teeth. Then the cold, the shocking, brutal cold of the mountain night after." Eleanor's mind was racing. "We can work with that. We have the steam room in the old greenhouse. And the ice house is still stocked." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a wounded beast or a stoic soldier, but a man, lost and searching. "Why are you doing this? You have your security. Your library. You have no obligation to fix me." Eleanor considered the question. The logical part of her said it was an interesting intellectual challenge. But another, newer part of her recognized the truth. "Because it is the right thing to do. And because I find I cannot share a house with a problem and not attempt to find a solution." A ghost of a smile, the first she had ever seen, touched his lips. "Ever the scientist. Ever the pragmatist," she corrected. Their sessions began. It was a strange, intimate, and profoundly unromantic process. In the damp heat of the makeshift steam room, Eleanor would sit with him, her notebook in hand, as he practiced the controlled breathing techniques she had taught him. She would talk to him in a calm, measured tone about neutral, logical things, the principles of thermodynamics, the migratory patterns of birds, to anchor him in the present while his body remembered the past. Afterwards, they would walk, shivering, to the ice house, where the shocking cold would jolt his system, teaching his body that the memory of the heat and the ensuing terror were not a present danger. It was grueling. There were setbacks. One session, the scent of the wet stone and steam triggered a full-blown episode. He threw a bench against the wall, shouting orders to men who weren't there, his eyes blind with panic. Eleanor did not flinch. She stood her ground, speaking to him firmly, repeatedly, until he came back to himself, collapsing to his knees, spent and trembling. Without a word, she knelt beside him and placed a blanket around his shoulders. He did not shrug it off. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fortress walls around Alastair Blackwood began to crumble. The nightmares became less frequent. The tremors in his hands subsided. He started to take an interest in the estate, riding out to meet his tenants, his posture less rigid, his gaze less haunted. He began to talk to her. Not just about the weather or books, but about India. The beauty of the jasmine flowers and the horror of the battlefield. The weight of command. The friends he had lost. One afternoon, they were in the library. Eleanor was perched on a ladder, searching for a specific botanical text, while Alastair was below, looking through a folio of maps. "This was my favorite place as a boy," he said, his voice echoing softly in the quiet room. "I used to hide in here from my tutor. Uncle Henry would always find me, but instead of scolding me, he'd pull down a book on Roman history or astronomy and we'd read for hours." Eleanor descended the ladder, the book in her hand. She looked at him, truly seeing the man he had been before the war, a curious, intelligent boy. He sounds like a remarkable man. He was. He would have liked you immensely. His gaze was warm, appreciative. It was a look she had never received from a man before. It wasn't about her appearance, which was plain, or her dowry, which was non-existent. It was about her. Her mind. Her spirit. Her heart gave a strange, uncalculated lurch. I found it, she said, her voice slightly breathless, holding up the botanical text. The one with the illustrations of Himalayan flora. He stepped closer, taking the book from her. His fingers brushed against hers, and this time, there was no recoil. A spark, warm and alive, passed between them. Their eyes met and held. The air in the library grew thick, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with the wild, untamed logic of the heart. The rule of separate lives, of no intimacy, hung in the air between them, a fragile parchment contract against the tidal wave of a feeling they had never agreed to. Alastair's gaze dropped to her lips. Eleanor's breath caught. The careful, logical world she had constructed was tilting on its axis. And then, the moment was shattered by the sound of a carriage rolling into the courtyard below. The intruder was Lady Beatrice Croft, Alastair's cousin and, as it transpired, the mother of the distant cousin, who stood to inherit if their marriage remained unconsummated. She was a woman of formidable size and even more formidable opinions, dressed in vibrant violet that clashed violently with the muted tones of Thornfield. "Alastair, my dear boy," she boomed, sweeping into the drawing room without waiting to be announced. Her eyes, sharp and missed nothing, scanned Eleanor from head to toe, taking in her simple, unadorned dress. And this must be the wife. Miss Ashford, was it? Lady Blackwood, Alastair corrected, his voice cool. He had retreated behind his stoic mask the moment she arrived. Of course, of course. Lady Beatrice settled herself on the best sofa, commandeering the space. I was in the county and simply had to see how you were faring. The rumors, you know. She gave a theatrical shudder. Dreadful place, Thornfield. So damp. And so isolated for a delicate creature. She aimed this last comment at Eleanor. I am not delicate, Lady Beatrice, Eleanor said, her tone even. I find the isolation conducive to study. Study. The woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. How charming. Well, I suppose one must find one's amusements. Her eyes flicked between them, noting the physical space they kept, the lack of any conjugal ease. But surely it is terribly lonely for Alastair. A man of his experience needs more stimulating company. The barb was expertly aimed. It implied everything their marriage was not: passion, intimacy, connection. Lady Beatrice stayed for 2 interminable days. She peppered them with intrusive questions, pointedly remarked on the separate bedrooms, and held forth on the importance of producing an heir to secure the Blackwood line. She was a living, breathing embodiment of the pressure they had so carefully avoided. Her presence, however, had an unintended consequence. It forced them into an alliance. They developed a silent language of shared glances and subtle cues to deflect her prying. They presented a united, if fabricated, front. The night before she was to leave, Lady Beatrice cornered Eleanor in the library. Let us speak plainly, my dear, she said, her false bonhomie gone. I know this marriage is a sham. A business arrangement to circumvent my dear Edgar's rightful claim. It will not stand. A man like Alastair, scarred and broken, is not fit to be a husband. And a woman like you, a scholar, has no idea how to be a wife. Do the sensible thing. Annul this farce. I can make it worth your while. Eleanor felt a hot surge of protectiveness, a feeling so fierce it stunned her. This woman saw Alistair as a broken object and her as a useless one. She saw nothing of the healing that had taken place, the strength that was returning, the fragile, beautiful understanding that was growing between them. "Thornfield is Alistair's home," Eleanor said, her voice like steel. "And I am his wife. There will be no annulment. You may take your offer and your opinions and depart." Lady Beatrice's face hardened. "We shall see," she hissed. "We shall see what the courts have to say about a marriage in name only." After the vile violet carriage finally disappeared down the drive, a heavy silence descended on Thornfield. The confrontation had laid bare the precariousness of their situation. The external threat had made their internal agreement feel flimsy, unsustainable. That evening, Alistair found Eleanor in the library, standing by the window, watching the moon rise over the moors. "Thank you," he said from the doorway. "For what you said to her." She turned. "I meant it." He walked into the room, stopping a few feet from her. The air was once again charged, as it had been before Lady Beatrice's arrival, but now the charge was different, deeper, more urgent. "She was right, you know," he said, his voice low. "About one thing. This arrangement. It was a solution for a broken man and a desperate woman. But I am not that broken man anymore. Not entirely. And you are the furthest thing from desperate I have ever known. You are the strongest person I have ever met." He closed the distance between them. He reached out, and with a tenderness that made her heart ache, he traced the line of her jaw with his scarred, unloved fingers. The touch was no longer clinical. It was a question. "Eleanor," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. "The rule, our agreement." She looked up into his eyes, the winter gray now warmed with a light she had put there. All her logic, all her calculations, fell away before the simple, overwhelming truth. "Some hypotheses," she said, her voice trembling with a new, wonderful fear, "are meant to be disproven." She rose onto her toes, closing the final, infinitesimal gap between them, and pressed her lips to his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a conflagration. It was the answer to a question they had been too afraid to ask. It was the shattering of a rule and the creation of a new, more beautiful law. It was the final, irrevocable fusion of two separate lives into one. The change was not instantaneous, but it was profound. The West Wing and the East Wing were abandoned. Eleanor's things were quietly moved into the master suite, a room that was no longer a place of solitary suffering but a sanctuary of shared warmth. The intimacy they had so fiercely outlawed became the cornerstone of their new life. It was not just physical, though that was a revelation in itself, a tender, passionate exploration that healed wounds deeper than any scar. It was an intimacy of the mind and spirit. They read together, debated together, and walked the moors together, their hands linked. Alistair's healing accelerated. The nightmares became a rarity. The man who emerged was not the boy he had been, nor the shattered hero he had become. He was something new, something stronger, a man who had known darkness and chosen the light, a man who had been shown his own strength by a woman who believed in logic, but had taught him the power of the heart. One crisp autumn morning, a year after Lady Beatrice's visit, Eleanor sat at the desk in the library, now a vibrant, lived-in room. She was writing a letter, not of scientific inquiry, but to a friend, detailing the renovations they were planning for the tenant cottages. Alistair came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on her head. He placed a small, flat object on the desk before her. It was a new plaque for the library door. It was made of polished oak, and engraved upon it were two names. Captain Lord Alistair Blackwood. Lady Eleanor Blackwood. It seemed only right, he murmured, kissing her hair. The library was always your sanctuary. But it brought us together. It is the heart of this house, and you are the heart of me. Eleanor looked at the plaque, her eyes blurring with happy tears. She thought of the cold, transactional meeting in the solicitor's office, the separate lives, the rule of no intimacy. It felt like a story about two other people. She covered his hands with hers, lacing their fingers together. His scarred, strong hand, and her capable, steady one. "It is perfect," she said. And it was. Not a calculated comfort, but a love built on the unshakable foundations of understanding, resilience, and the beautiful, unpredictable science of the human heart.